Small group today. So good morning. It's summer. Yeah, it's summer. So just want to go ahead and welcome everyone. And for those that are online and the small group in the room, and let's go ahead and get started with some introductions. Mary Ann Lindblad.
Eileen Cody.
Mike. Hung and Doug, please introduce yourselves.
Hello, Douglas Barthold, board member. It says that the video is disabled for me right now. It won't let me turn my camera on.
Oh, okay.
Me too.
Get that fixed.
There we go.
That's on.
There we go.
Great.
There, welcome. It's nice to see you both.
Sorry, Hong Chong board member. I had a late start this morning and couldn't make it down there on time, so I went straight to my office.
Doug.
Doug Barthold, board member. Hi, everybody.
Great. So let's quickly do staff.
So Mike Neuenschwander, director for the program here for HCA. Simon Borman, policy analyst.
And then staff that are on online.
Good morning. This is Ryan Bistresi. I'm the Assistant Chief Pharmacy Officer here at Healthcare Authority.
Expecting anyone else?
This is Dana Guler from the Attorney General's office.
Dana, okay. Welcome.
Kelly online?
Kelly. Well.
Hi. Oh, hi, I'm Kelly and I'm the PDAP data analyst.
Anyone else that you're expecting? That's good. All right. Well, then let's go ahead and get started. So again, welcome. It's great to see you all, and I hope you're having a wonderful summer. And should we go ahead and start with Mike's report?
Yeah. So just a director update. Let me pull up my list. So we are still looking for that elusive fifth board member. We've had a few names that have been sent to the governor's office, and so we've been waiting for them to go work on the next steps for that. So there still has been interest in that, and hopefully we will get that resolved in the near future. And then let's take it over to Simon. Has some updates on the advisory report.
Oh, great.
So as you know, we opened up an application for members of the advisory group. There's two phases of that. The first stage is finding a core advisory group, and there are up to 9 slots available for that, and a range of expertise that they can fall into. And I can share my screen just to make it easier to see what those available roles are. And what we've received so far, so these are the potential expertise that we're looking for. And so far we've received 5 applications. Jim Freeberg, Ronnie Shore, Laura Berry, Tim Lynch, and Daria McGrew. And across the 5 of them, they hit all of the different buckets except for one, which is clinical and health services research. And so we're leaving the application open, accepting applications on a rolling basis, just to get that filled up. But I think at this point, we can move forward with getting these folks onboarded. I've sent over the applications to you all to review.
So timing wise, what do you think?
So I think the goal is I need to look back at the schedule. I think it was
I was gonna have a little bit of a timeline here.
Okay.
So for the summer, the board members to take a look at those applications, and then in September we can go ahead and appoint the advisory group members who we would like, and then along with that, for our September meeting, hopefully looking at a draft dashboard for some of the drug selection metrics that we're going to be looking at today, and then also reviewing a draft drug review outline that Marina's been working on. So what our drug review is going to look like, we're going to be pulling the data from that. And so yeah, that's kind of the next steps here for the summer and coming into the fall for our next meeting.
Great. Thank you. Douglas or Hung, any questions about that? All right. So, anything else? That's it for your report.
That's it. That's
For your
it for me.
report, all right. So we'll go ahead and on this item, we actually do have to take a vote to approve the eligible drug list identification policy. So Mike Kelly.
Yeah, so that is the policy that we were reviewing last time. Talked about it for the last couple of meetings. So this is a policy that we'll be using in order to create that drug list as required by the legislation with the drugs under those different categories, you know, over 60,000 per year with a 15% or 50% increase, et cetera. Yeah, I think
Gone through it.
yeah, we've gone through it a couple times here, so I think we're ready for vote.
Okay, that sounds great. Oh, question.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry to not that I didn't raise this earlier, but I actually do have an issue with one of the items on the in the policy, and so from pharma, and they have a pretty good point in there on the 7-year market requirement. And essentially, if you look at item 1D, sorry, it's 2(1)(d), where we say a prescription drug on the market for at least 7 years means the drug ingredient has been on the market for 7 years. And that actually is sort of contradictory to what it says in the statute about identifying prescription drugs that have been on the market for at least 7 years. And so the way that we define prescription drugs and is sort of in line with what the statute says is not then by drug ingredient being on the market for 7 years, which is what we then have in item 2(1)(d). And so that seemed like something we should either correct or clarify, just because it does seem to be contradictory.
So what would you suggest in terms of language change?
So
Yeah.
there's a couple options. One, so you see that just above that in item 2(1)(c), we do define a prescription drug. And so if in the next item in 2(1)(d) we said that the prescription drug has been on the market, I mean, I guess it seems redundant, but right now the way it's worded with the drug ingredient being on the market for at least 7 years just seems to be sort of contradictory to our definition of prescription drug.
And Ryan, I think, has a comment.
Yeah, so the reason that we made this determination for it to be the drug ingredient is really around the biosimilars, right? So if we're looking at the requirement for looking at a biosimilar and trying to determine if it's an affordability review, if that biosimilar had to be on the market for 7 years, you would be looking at the launch price from over 7 or 8 years ago. So we were looking at that and felt that the legislature did not want you in, let's say, 2025 to be looking at the launch price of a drug in 2018 and say that it was unaffordable in 2018 and have a new requirement for an upper payment limit and an affordability review in 2028. So really, we felt that if it were not the drug ingredient, there would never be an opportunity to look at a biosimilar with how it was written. And that would just invalidate really any biosimilar review that you could do, because you would be looking at the prices from 7 years ago when it launched versus all of the other drugs, which would be within that last year. So in order to accommodate for that, we used the drug ingredient.
Okay, thanks. That makes sense for the biosimilars. But what about for brands and generics and those criteria, which make up, I think, the vast majority of our eligible drug list? Is there? I guess like my the reason I'm concerned is just like because of the, I guess I worry about, if this was challenged, if there's any issue with the legality of defining the 7 years by drug ingredient rather than with our own definition of prescription drug.
Well, I think one of the challenges is that we do see line entries and kind of new generics. And so we do see, some drugs that may be on the market and then the manufacturer may pull it and then introduce a new, NDC associated with it. So that could essentially, get around this, 7 year mark. So even though that the drug has been approved and is able to be marketed, because of that product availability, there could be games played in which a drug could be, pulled from the market and then a new one entered, and that would reset that clock, and we wouldn't be able to do the
Sure.
affordability review for it.
So yeah, I agree on the justification. I think it does a good job of doing what we're trying to do. I just and obviously I'm not a lawyer, so the reason I ask about it is because it does seem like it's just the language that we're using does seem to not match the statute, and so I wonder if we're going to have any problems with that. Is that something we should be concerned about?
And so maybe we can ask Dana, who's our AAG on the call today. I know that she hasn't been part of a lot of discussions since we've had Michael Tunick, but she might be able to talk about, how we went through our rulemaking and defining it in WAC and kind of some of the ways that we tried to address it with some of the rulemaking.
Yeah, thanks. Let's see. My Zoom won't let me turn my camera on either, but I am here. And you're right, I have not been part of any of these discussions for about 9 months. I advised on some of this very early on, so I haven't had a chance to look at any of these substantive issues or questions. So I'm not really in a position to give you a good answer today. But if that's something you would like a deeper look at, then we can take the question back, and Michael or I can look at it and get back to you with a more thorough legal analysis.
I mean,
That's probably what we need to do. Yeah, it sounds like that's what we need to do, would be my suggestion, and just let's put this one on hold and have it ready for next time. Does that work for everybody?
Yep.
Okay, then let's just go ahead then.
that's fine with me too.
Hey, Doug, just a comment. I'd like to keep talking about that with you for a little bit. So are we worried that when we call it a drug ingredient, because drug ingredient can come out anytime, it's just when it becomes a drug. I mean, that's when really you actually can start using it, right? And so a lot of the ingredients have been around for a while. And so when we define it this way, and I think we were alluding to it, it has been out or in use long enough to be eligible. I think that's when we need to interpret the drug ingredient a bit further.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think Ryan's point was spot on about the potential gaming that could exist if we just did it at like the NDC level.
Yep.
Okay. And so, yeah, I completely agree on this justification. I just wanted to make sure that we are in line with the statute.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I was trying to think through, like, okay, how, but I can see the issues with it. Oh.
Right, well, I think at this point, then we'll go ahead and put that on hold and work on some language over the next few weeks and have something to propose next meeting. So let's go ahead and Simon previewing the annual report.
I'll pull that up in there as well.
Okay, thanks.
So each year we are tasked with submitting an annual report to the legislature. Last year's was fairly short. It was just, we appointed a board and bios. This year it's also fairly short, but a little bit more going on. And if you're wondering why we're doing this in July, the review process takes so long before it can be submitted that we basically start drafting it in the summer, put in what we've done up till now, leave placeholders for what we expect to come over the rest of the year, and then submit it to the legislature in September. And so the key areas here, at the beginning of the year, we selected a board chair, a vice chair, we ratified policies and procedures. Over the course of this year, we'll be creating a PDAB advisory group. We developed an initial drug list, and that's part of the agenda today, actually. And then, as you know, we contracted with Portal. So, section is fairly short, just kind of going over those key points. This is posted on the PDAB website and has been shared with board members. So, we go through it in more detail later on time. But you can see the draft, so we still have things to fill in over the course of the year. But just gives a brief description of each of these milestones so we can.
Let's do December 15th. Okay. So we've got a little more time for folks to review, and if they have any questions or concerns, and then whatever you add to it.
Yeah, well, and there are a number of levels of internal review, right? So we're gonna send it all. Sure you're well aware.
Yes. Multiple levels.
Yes, so it's got.
We're both laughing at this from different viewpoints.
Yeah, so
I like the fill in the blank,
Yeah.
aspect.
So, if you do have comments or questions or things you want to edit, sooner rather than later is better. And I think we'll have time to bring this back to take a look at it again in September, for our September board meeting before it goes towards like final review through the whole system. And we will be able to, during our November meeting, to look at like final products will look like, but at that point it won't really be edits because they need to submit it by the end of December, so the legislature can look at it at the start of the next year. So
Of course, sessions.
We have to read every
Yeah.
So,
So just reminding folks then to go ahead, and if you have comments, we want to have those by the September meeting, so we can get this wrapped up on time.
and knowing we are doing this 6 months in advance, so we are forecasting a little bit of stuff that hasn't even been done yet, right? But in order to meet the timelines, it's the process we have to
But
follow.
they changed the date, right? Wasn't it earlier that you had to report last year? I thought.
So December 15th, I believe, is the date that it's supposed to be in. Well, it's like officially done, but to get to that mark.
Well, I know you start sending it here in like September, right?
Well, probably, I think it's at the end of this month, we send our first draft, right?
Yeah, the first, that sounds about timing right, that sounds about right.
So,
All right. Just a reminder that for everyone, make sure you have a chance to review it closely.
read it, if you've got comments, get it back to us ASAP.
All right. Well, Mike, we wanted to talk about the updates to the WAC.
Yes. So for WAC, again, another process that takes a little bit of time and has to go through a number of levels of review. There were 2 bills that added some language concerning the PDABs where we have to make some tweaks. Bill 1508 was talking about sharing data between the PDAB and Healthcare Cost Transparency Boards, HCCT. And so we're working to figure out what the wording is to be able to do that. Additionally, there's another bill, 1105, that requires the board. So we already had a 30-day requirement for public comment when we set upper payment limits. This just simply specifies that we need to have a start and an end date for those 30 days. So we need to have that publicly available, so that way people know exactly when it opens and closes for that 30-day comment. So that's something else we're putting in the WAC. So those are the 2 things we need to look at according to other legislation that's been passed. And if the board has anything that you want to change in the WAC, again, due to the timeline of how long it takes, again, speak now. I know Simon sent out some requests. If you had any things or ideas to have those ready. But yeah, so any other, Doug?
Yeah, I don't have any suggestions, but I was just wondering, can you tell us which sections of the WAC you said there's two things that you want to change?
Correct.
And yeah, I mean,
So the first one goes under the data confidentiality section is where we're looking to put that. It has to do with sharing data with HCCT.
okay.
The other one, we were just going to create a new section. We aren't at the point where we need to do upper payment limits yet. That's still a couple of years out, obviously. But because it's pertaining to that, we were just going to create that initial upper payment limits section. So a whole new section that we
Okay.
tacked on at the end of the current WAC.
All right. That sounds good. And so then, and are we reviewing those today, or is that you just telling us that that's the plan?
Yeah, I still haven't gotten this like
Okay.
officially in the document that this is what we need to do. So we're working in terms of what would have to happen with drafting, and I can show that during our next board meeting in September.
So to be prepared for the
Yeah.
next board meeting for any comments. And then
Yeah.
you'll want to vote then or the next
So
meeting
the
after
WAC
that?
isn't that something we
don't
vote
have to
on
vote on,
because this
okay.
is kind of its own separate
Just
process
process.
outside.
Okay.
Yeah. But if you do have anything else that you want to add to the WAC, now is the time to say so. So that way we can work on writing it in.
I'm just curious, staff doesn't have any more things that they think that we need to do wax on, like
Right.
as we move forward?
Right now, no, because the other stuff in terms of like the drug reviews and the upper payment limits, where we are gonna want more of that meat, we haven't completed that yet. And so, and then two, just because of the timing of what we need, submitting the stuff now to get it done by December 31st. Again, unless we do it right now and have it all ready, it won't get done in time. So that stuff would be for the next year.
So you're saying this is really an additive process?
Yeah. Oh yeah, no, the WAC as our program goes,
Yeah.
and as we are adding these different sections and building the program, yeah, example, the upper payment limit section, there will be
Because
every
unfortunately,
year.
sadly, it's the long process that it takes to write a WAC or amend a WAC.
Yeah.
So you'll be in that kind of flux state probably on an ongoing basis for a while.
Yeah.
Sounds
Yeah,
like.
so no, I foresee the next couple of years, we are gonna be adding stuff, and next year is where, potentially add, more meaty stuff, whereas this is more, smaller edits on specific things related to our program.
Right, any other comments? Questions? Well, I think we're doing really well with time.
Yeah.
So let's go ahead and got Kelly and Ryan and Portal to talk about the current eligible drug list.
Yeah,
And
so
then the
maybe, because Portal's not gonna hop on till 9:15.
Okay,
When we talk about the drug selection methodology. But I guess Kelly, Ryan, anything you want to talk about in terms of our list? And does the board have any questions specifically on the list that was generated?
I didn't print it either.
The whole list is.
Oh,
at
in
the
the
back
back.
of this,
Oh
but-
my God.
Yeah, you
bring
need-
my-
oh, it's that teeny tiny, yeah, well,
Okay.
it comes with a magnifying glass.
But it doesn't have just the 14, right? You've got, this is everything.
That met criteria.
Right, well, the ones that had the two. I was intrigued by the nitroglycerin.
There was some on there that really surprised me.
I was like,
So,
that's been around for.
yeah. However, they made the list kind of thing.
Yeah, right,
So that surprising, most not though.
yeah, well, yeah.
So it looks like our distribution, when I look at like how, the categories of how you get onto the list, kind of matches what we saw in Colorado, right? Where it's mostly course of treatment over 60,000, although there's just a different threshold. And then there's a good chunk of branded biologic with a greater than or equal to 15%. And then is there only 2 generics that made it? Am I reading that right?
I believe you're right about the 2 generics. And yeah, the Colorado threshold I think was
Yeah.
30,000 and ours is 60,000. So their list will be larger than ours, but for the upper ones on their list, it should be the same.
Well, that's good. I mean, I think it's encouraging that the distribution of categories is matches theirs, and also sort of the number of drugs that made it in matches what our intuition suggested it would be given the differences in the rules, and so it suggests that we applied the rules correctly, which is good. Yeah, I think this spreadsheet looks great. It's very helpful, well organized.
Any other comments or questions?
Hey, Ryan, I'm looking at the list and the category for some of these non-specialty, and I mean I didn't fact check or any of that, but just to see some of them, and it says the course of treatment is over 60,000. It doesn't seem correct. I mean, Lamictal is an example. Is it truly it's over 60,000?
So I think the way that it met that threshold is it was looking at that high dose. And so if a patient were to be taking that Lamictal at that dose, they'd be taking more tablets per day. So I think in the real world, someone that would be taking that higher dose would likely be on a higher strength, and that higher strength I don't think appeared on that list. So, based off of how we ran the calculations in the data set, that's how some of these drugs appeared. But, to you as the board, you may look at that drug and say, we don't think that that necessarily is one of the drugs that is causing affordability challenges to Washingtonians. And you may not prioritize it, but still, based off of the way that we calculated it, it does make the list. But I think to your point and to the points of the other board members that, some of these other drugs are ones that you do recognize as causing affordability challenges, and likely those are the ones that would make it to the next step, whereas this example, the Lamictal, probably won't.
Yeah, and I think there's opportunity just for the team to clean it up because we might not know, right? I've seen it before just because of practice, but for others, they might not. And so, um, just yeah, I'm sure there's a lot more work into this that we need to do. But thanks, Ryan, for explaining, clarifying.
One part of that too will be as we go through these next steps of the process where we're trying to prioritize the data that we specifically want to see that we'll be talking about here shortly. That will help refine those drugs down more specifically to measures and things that we feel are, or that the board feels is important to be looking at as we take this list of 400 some odd drugs and try and get it down to a handful, right? So I think the purpose of this first go around is just getting that list, meeting the initial legislative demands, and creating a list that's done in a way that we can make sure we get a good showing of what could be out there to meet the legislative intent. But then our filters will help bring that down and eliminate some of these other drugs that we're like, oh yeah, maybe that's not really the kind of thing that we want to look at, right? So
Yeah, the high dose could be super rare, and then also the rebates may actually could effectively bring the price way down. The use of the drug in general could be super rare, but I think I like this first poll as sort of just like this is the most it could possibly be, and then we filter from there.
exactly, yeah. That way we're not missing stuff, right? So it gives us a good broad net. Okay. questions, thoughts on this list? As we take our initial look at it?
Well, I've got a question, because I don't remember how the legislation, like with the NDCs that are on multiple lists. And there's what, 1, 2, 3, it's all the patch on the nitroglycerin. So if we do the review, does it count as one drug doing a review when it's the same drug, it's just a different strength? Or would each one have to have a review?
It's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I hadn't thought about that so much.
Because it would
Yeah.
seem like it would be the same one review for all of them.
Same.
But I'm just, this may be one of those things that we have to figure out whether we need clarification on a legislative level or whether we can do it in a whack. I mean, those are.
Brian? Catch that?
That is a good question and one that I haven't thought of. So, we might need to take that back and, kind of think about what that intent was and what we might be able to do with it in whack. But that's, I think, something that we'll have to take back.
Yeah, no, it was just impressed me that the nitroglycerin patch was obviously, I thought that was great technology.
I mean, ultimately, it's going to depend on the level at which we apply the upper payment limit, right? That's where sort of the rubber meets the road. And so we would want to, that is something that we will specify in the section of the WAC about the upper payment limit, right? The unwritten, non-existent future section of the WAC about the upper payment limit. Is that right? That's where we will say the UPL will apply at some level, we'll define that level, and that level could be NDC, or it could be all of the, whatever the 6 rows of nitroglycerin, all of them get looped into one.
Right, because I think, one of the things that we had thought about, but again, we need to go through the details is, is it that manufacturer's version of that drug? So, to, Hung's point earlier, that Lamictal, if we were to, choose that, then would we only apply it to that low strength NDC, like the whatever 2 milligrams, but the 20 milligrams don't. And so then would everyone then switch to the 2 milligrams and begin taking, 10 tablets instead of one of the 20? So I think there are some things that we would need to think about, operationally, and what we would want to, have as the intended effect of these upper payment limits. So that way we don't, necessarily have a situation like that.
Well, and then we run into different makers of different prices. And so going back to the point of we looking at NDC, a drug ingredient, I'm assuming there's quite a few makers of nitro patches, right? And so this one happens to hit that threshold to be on the list, whereas the other 4 or 5 might not. And so what do we do? Is it worth, putting in UPL on it?
Then in multiple indications will matter too, because the course of treatment, we're defining we're defining in a way that gives us the maximum possible catch to see how much these things could possibly be. But if there's multiple indications where the course of treatment varies widely, big differences in course of treatment or big differences in doses, we would only want to apply an upper payment limit to the indications where that actually do have the dosage and course of treatment that meet that threshold of unaffordability, which could be a rare indication or it could be a common one. So I think it's important that as we get down, as we filter this drug list down, we have to have a way of incorporating indication. Relatedly, one idea that I think could be helpful for that is if one possible grouping could be at the NDA level, the new drug application level, because I think, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but every NDA is for a new indication, and so that could potentially be helpful for us to separate, whatever, if the same ingredient used for two different indications.
You mean SNDA, the supplemental for new indication?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Other comments, questions?
Actually, yeah, Ryan, I have a question. Would it be like how hard is it to link our current eligible drug list, with its how many rows do we have here? 470 rows. How hard is it to link each of those NDCs to a specific NDA or SNDA? Or I guess it would be an ANDA for the last two, but yeah.
I think there is a field in the database that we use that does have a table with NDA information. If not, there might be a table that we could download from the FDA that might have that information. So I have a few ideas on how we might be able to link the list that we provided with a list that finds those NDAs or SNDAs or other application numbers. But we don't have that necessarily readily available right now. But I have a few ideas on how we might be able to make that list.
Great. That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of like, to me, I consider that like as a possible option for how we can easily separate by indication. But if there's another way to get to do that, then we can do that too. But it just seems like one possible strategy.
Anything else?
Yeah. So we've got about 5 minutes before we expect.
5-minute break, and then we can come back. Portals here.
I think that makes sense. Yeah, 5 minutes. All right. See you in 5. Thank you. Nice little break. The portal folks have arrived. Is that okay? And we started out and had a bit of a conversation about the list, and I think we just want to go ahead and continue that. So Kelly or Ryan?
Kelly is up, has the presentation.
Does she have a presentation?
Sorry, are you studying the presentation?
Yeah, we could go ahead, Kelly.
Okay.
There we are.
Okay, I'm sorry. For some reason, I don't have permission to share my video, so you'll just have to listen to my voice. So, since the last meeting, we've been able to touch base with each board member to get a sense of what their priorities are and what data measures they're interested in. So when it comes to selecting drugs for affordability review, so I'll be presenting the information that we gathered from these meetings, and I'll also go into a little more detail about whether the various data measures proposed are feasible or not. Okay. So before I jump into those data measures, I'll go over again what the board is required to consider when selecting drugs for affordability review. Then I'll go over the proposed data measures and discussion points to think about, and then we can have some more time for discussion and questions. So this is a reminder of where we are in the process. So right now we're at the selecting drugs for affordability review stage. Okay, so a reminder before we jump into the proposed data measures. The bill says that the board must look at 3 data measures, and that's the prescription drugs and availability, the class of prescription drugs and the availability of therapeutic equivalents, input from relevant advisory groups, and the average patient's out-of-pocket cost for the drug. The out-of-pocket cost for the drug. And then also the board can choose up to 24 drugs a year to review. All right, so let's jump into the data measures that the board proposed. So just an illustration here, basically what I said in the last slide. So just when deciding whether to select a drug for affordability review, we have these 3 required data measures, and the board can also look at other data measures that aren't in the bill. So I would categorize the data measures brought up by the board into these 4 main categories. So we have drugs on multiple lists, drug costs, utilization, and treatment options. So feel free to stop me as I go into more detail and let me know if I missed anything or if you have any other data measures you thought of and want to add. And I'm anticipating that there'll be lots of discussion, so feel free to speak up as we move through the slides. So first, we have drugs on multiple lists. So when selecting drugs for review, the board could consider whether a drug meets multiple review thresholds and is therefore on multiple lists. For example, a drug increased in price by both 15% in the last 12 months and 50% in the last 3 years. And another consideration could be whether other states have identified the drug for review. So even though Washington may have different review thresholds in other states, if the drug happens to be on another state's affordability review list, this could be useful to know because perhaps there may be some information sharing if another state already did a lot of work on pulling the data for that drug. And the board could also consider, for example, whether they want to review the same drug as another state. Another category is drug costs. So there are lots of proposed data measures for this category. So we have the total drug costs, the out-of-pocket cost, which is one of the required data measures in the bill. We have member paid amount, cost per member per month, rebate amount, and manufacturer assistance programs and coupons. So later on, I have a slide on data measures we might need clarification or definitions for, like, for example, what are the costs that should be considered when calculating the total drug cost? And like, what is the difference between out-of-pocket cost and member paid amount? And something to keep in mind that I'll mention later is whether you want to whittle down the amount of data measures you're going to use to select drugs, or are you just going to look at all the data measures available? For utilization, there are proposals of looking at the percentage of the population using the prescription drug, the number of people using the prescription drug, the utilization by disease state, and the utilization by specialty and non-specialty drugs. So I think these were getting at the idea of, does the board want to review perhaps the drugs that are used by a lot of people but are not as expensive, or drugs that are really expensive but not used by a lot of people? And of course, these 2 scenarios aren't mutually exclusive. There could be a drug that is both expensive and used by a lot of people, but these are some scenarios that come to mind for these data measures. And finally, the board members proposed considering treatment options, for example, whether the drug has therapeutic equivalents, therapeutic alternatives, or generics available. So basically, are there other options instead of taking this drug? And another consideration is step therapy or utilization management. So does the health plan require patients to take alternative drugs that are less expensive before they can access the more expensive drug? So just to go back to the previous graphic that I showed, now that we went through the proposed data measures, we hit 2 of the 3 required, and I have a slide later talking about how we anticipate input from advisory groups did. So I showed this during our last meeting, but I want to get everyone reacquainted with the data sources again before I jump into my next few slides. So a very important data source is our Washington All Payers Claim database. which is where we will get our utilization and out-of-pocket cost-related data. And I have a few slides coming up going into more detail about this data source. And we also have potential manufacturer and PBM data. And I'll talk about why I'm using the word potential here in some slides coming up later as well. And then we have our commercial drug price databases, First Data Bank and Metaspan, which is where we'll get our drug price data. So a little background on the Washington APCD. So it contains claims dating back to 2014 for about 70% of the total Washington state population. And all health carriers in Washington state are required to report their data, as well as state Medicaid plans, PEB, SEB, third-party administrators, and the Washington State Labor and Industries Program. And self-funded plans are not required to submit, but they can do so on a voluntary basis. So as with any data sources, there are some strengths and limitations to the APCD data. So the APCD is great because it captures data from a very large portion of the Washington state population, because it contains data from most public and commercial payers in the state. And the PDAP team also has access to the APCD data, which is important if we want to use it. And there's also some great technical support provided to us. Some cons of using the APCD are that it does not capture the entire state population, particularly the uninsured people or self-funded plans that choose not to report, and also other types of claims, such as claims paid by auto insurance. So on a similar note, other missing data would be like manufacturer rebates or coupons provided to patients. And then also another limitation of the APCD is data quality. So for example, there could be a lack of consistency with regards to data quality across different submitters.
Doug has a question.
Yeah, thanks. Just a question about the all-payer claims database. What amount of detail do we have about the plan or the payer for each claim? Can we link? Is there like a plan ID that we can link to? I'm thinking about the UPL coverage guide that we are working on now that was just sent around. Is it possible to know if each claim is covered by a plan that would be where the UPL would apply if it was a UPL?
So no, the APCD just has like the plan type, like HMO or Medicaid or Medicare. Okay. So it doesn't go into that amount of detail.
Do any of our data sources have a plan ID or anything like that we can link to, that we can then know whether or not a UPL would apply?
At our moment, I believe our only claim source of claims data is the APCD.
Okay. Well, we'll definitely want to keep that in mind. I think we've spoken about this a bit before, but yeah, I just want to emphasize that like ideally, these criteria that we're using for selecting drugs for affordability review, especially the cost and utilization, we would want to measure those in plans where the UPL can apply, because we could potentially you can imagine you said it doesn't cover the entire state population. You can imagine a situation where most of the claims are driven by plans where the UPL wouldn't apply, and then we would have measures of cost and utilization for people for whom we will never affect with any of our policies, and so that would not be the best way to. That's part of it. It's an extreme example, but that's what we want to avoid, and so we should keep that in mind as we measure cost and utilization, because we want to make sure that we to try to be aware if we're measuring it for people that where we don't have any policy leverage.
Kelly, you mentioned 70%. It covers 70% of the state, right? Lives. Okay, so looks like the 30% are probably for the self-funded, I'm assuming.
I did not look up the statistics for what make up the other 30% is, but yeah, probably uninsured, self-funded, and then like I said, some like miscellaneous types of claims, like if it's like paid by your auto insurance or something.
So that's good then. If this self-funded is the bulk of what we're missing, because we can't affect them, that they're not subject to the UPL anyway. So that's encouraging.
That it would have to be mostly the self-funded that's not included and the uninsured. I mean, and what we're like 4% uninsured in the state, so 4 to 5, I don't know where we're at lately. So yeah, actually, I'm encouraged that there's that many of the self-funded that are kicking in their data to the APCD.
And we're up to 70%.
Yeah,
That's better than what I would have expected.
yeah.
And then I have one other question, just as we calculate costs and utilization. Is there any way in the APCD to know the indication?
No, I don't believe there is a way to look in the APCD and know what the indication is because I think it's just the pharmacy claims, and because ICD-10s, aren't on pharmacy claims, there's no way to actually link that. We'd have to go into the EHR
Yeah.
to get that level of data.
Huh. Okay.
I can't speak to specifically the Washington APCD, but in general, for claims data, right? Like you link medical and pharmacy data to make those determinations. So it does get complicated. I mean, they're assuming there is a unique patient identifier, right? You can identify, but even in studies where people do this, where you sort of look for indication, we've done this in some studies, like you look for indications, like how much of a drug is being used for different indications. And there's always this sort of number of claims that like you can't find the indication, like there's no ICD code that sort of matches. And there's also the concern that the ICD codes don't match the FDA labeling. So often, like, there might be some very granular FDA labeling distinctions that like there's just no way to tease apart based on even if you are able to link to medical claims. So I would say that like in some cases, claims data more generally and APCD data more generally can be used to identify. It's a more complicated task, but it cannot work in all circumstances, and it's imperfect.
Okay, thanks. So yeah, as we move forward, yeah, we want to keep that in mind, like for all the same reasons I mentioned before about the importance of indications when we're grouping when we're defining the level of drugs that we're analyzing. Maybe there's some way we can just, and I apologize, this is a bit of a digression to, going back to just sort of like this level of drug conversation. And but maybe there's some way that we can flag NDCs or ingredients, like, or generic names that are commonly used for multiple indications as sort of just like as something that we might want to consider as we're selecting drugs.
I'll just say, Doug, I got an update from Matt on your first part of the meeting, and I apologize I wasn't here. But in general, no country that does any process, and I've never, I don't know of any sort of contracts around pricing that do like differential pricing by indication. And because it's challenging, because how do you actually know? Like when like there's no requirement to submit unless a PBM or a health plan requires a prior authorization. So then they sort of do know, right? Because it's a checkbox by the doctor of like what indication the patient's using it for. And again, because defining an indication is hard. In cancer, for example, like there might be two indications. One's first line therapy and one's second line therapy. Are they all lung cancer, or are those two separate indications? From the FDA standpoint, there was a separate review process. It might be separate, regulatory processes for determining whether or not the drugs were safe and effective in those two different uses. From a common perception standpoint, it's all lung cancer, right? I'm just like giving a broad example. So it is not so, it's not very easy. Or kids is another example. Like, an antibiotic that treats a particular infection, and then it's studied also in kids. Are those two different indications, or is it just like one indication? So defining an indication is not super straightforward either. And again, like, especially when you go to claims, like those things aren't going to line up. Because they're not required to. There's nothing that's binding the FDA to think about ICD codes when it's thinking about how to write labeling or approve labeling for drugs.
Yeah. And I mean, so one of the things we were talking about before is just like you could end up with, vastly different costs for a course of treatment for two different indications, just because obviously the length can vary and the dose can vary so much. And so what we did in our first step of defining the eligible drug list was we sort of took what the max of what it could, the max values to just get like the max it could possibly be for a course of treatment. But like as we, if we're evaluating whether or not that drug should have an affordability review or whether it should have an upper payment limit, even if we can't calculate the cost of treatment at an indication specific level, which I think would be ideal. But if we can't do that, then I think we at least want to try to know which drugs are commonly used for multiple indications as just as an additional criterion on which we make our decisions. Does that make sense?
It does, though I don't think it fully gets at your max question. I mean, I think, right. I mean, I agree with you, but I think that it,
the max is that's sort of just to get the biggest list of drugs possible. We have a very broad inclusion criteria at the first step of eligible drug list, and then as we refine, some of those maybe they won't make it because
right. So to your point though, the APCD can be used to look at like the average amount paid per patient, right? Like that or over the course of a year, right? So for just like if you just, line up every patient who used the drug and figure out how much they spent on the drug that year, or how much them plus their insurer spent. That can be done. That's data that the Colorado PDEP has presented to its board in the last 5 cost affordability reviews that it did. So that is how they sort of that was how they thought about sort of defining sort of the course of treatment was based on basically just real life use. They did not stratify it by indication. So it's built in that if a drug is used, 50-50 for indications, that would be sort of weighted. If it's 90% for one indication, 10% for the other, right? It's going to be weighted heavily towards the one indication that matters because they're just sort of looking at all patients. So it's weighted by the number of patients, by patients. So it's kind of the weighting was sort of built in.
Yeah. And I like that. I worry about the bimodal. If there's like a bimodal indication where like, it happens to be, cheap and short in the real world for one indication, and then long and expensive in another, and then we have
Right, so to your point, that's not right. So but a flag saying that a drug is used for multiple indications doesn't tell you whether there's going to be a bimodal distribution. So there are some drugs I know of where the price does vary because it's either weight-based dosing or the dosing is different for different indications. But oftentimes, even for drugs with multiple indication, the price for a course of treatment is very similar, right? So I think that your question is there different prices for different indications? And if your question is, are there multiple indications on the label? That won't get you all the way there. And that would be, I mean, most drugs would have multiple indications on the label, or many drugs would, and not give you an answer to your question of is there different by different
I was just thinking of that as like
really what you're trying to drive at.
Yeah, that could be. I was thinking of that as like a flag to trigger sort of like either further investigation or like just something else to keep in our minds as we are making a decision about that drug. But yeah, we can. I think we can move on, and we'll consider that as we think about these things.
All right, so the next data source would be manufactured PBM data. So in the bill, manufacturer is defined as person, corporation, or entity engaged in the manufacture of prescription drugs sold in or into Washington State. And the bill stipulates that the manufacturers must comply with PDAB's request for data when conducting an affordability review, but there isn't anything in there about needing to comply if PDAB asks for the data at the drug selection stage. But PDAB can use manufacturer and PBM data that is presently collected by HCA's Drug Price Transparency Program. So for those of you who don't know what that is, it's a program created by the state legislature, and the goal of this program is to develop a better understanding of the drivers and impacts of drug costs. And this program collects data submitted by health carriers, PBMs, drug manufacturers, and pharmacy services administrative organizations. So I copied the part of the RCW that states that. Okay, so back in a previous slide, I checked off 2 of the 3 required data measures that the bill requires the board to consider when selecting drugs for affordability review. And the remaining unchecked data measure is advisory group input. So these are some of the ways that we think the advisory group input could be incorporated. So a question to think about is, where in the drug selection process does the board want to incorporate advisory group feedback? So should it be when the board is selecting data measures, or should the board let the advisory group give feedback after it has the proposed list of drugs selected for review? Or should the board incorporate advisory group feedback every step of the way? So once we create a dashboard like similar to the one that the Colorado PDAP has, that can be shared with the advisory group. So the advisory group would have access to the data measures. So yeah, the question is where in the process do you want advisory group feedback to be incorporated? And I'm going to address feasibility of pulling these data measures with this table, so we can see whether we have the data sources available to pull each data measure. So you can see that most of the data measures have check marks, and at the bottom, you'll notice 2 data measures that have exclamation mark icons. So I put these to indicate that these measures are probably not feasible at this point in time. For example, for rebate amount, theoretically, manufacturers and PBMs would have that data, but we don't know if we can get it from them, and the TPT program does not have that data, so we can't get it from them either. And then same goes for patient assistance programs and coupons. This is also data that the TPT program is not collecting at the moment, and we don't know if we can get that from the manufacturers. And then continuing on to more data measures, just directing your attention to the exclamation point icons once again. So we have it for therapeutic alternative availability and step therapy and utilization management. So therapeutic alternatives are not that straightforward to pull. So Ryan, feel free to chime in here, because sometimes there could be other drugs treating the same condition that are in a different therapeutic class. So this would require some researching to determine so that we get like all of the therapeutic alternatives available. And then for step therapy and utilization management, technically the PBMs would have this data, but again, there's no guarantee that we would be able to get it from them at this stage. And then finally, we have the proposed data measure of whether other states have selected the drug for review. So this is definitely more accessible than the manufacturer or PBM data, but it would also require like manual research, because not only would we have to research what drugs the other states selected, we would also have to look at their statute and what their thresholds are to determine if they are different from ours. Okay, so now that we have established the proposed data measures for selecting drugs for review, I do have some questions for the board members who proposed some of the data measures. So first, what costs are we talking about when we talk about the total cost of a prescription drug? Second is, what is the difference between out-of-pocket cost versus member paid amount? I know a board member mentioned like including premiums in paid amount. And then another question is, if we wanted to look at utilization regarding specialty versus non-specialty drugs, what criteria would be used to classify drugs as specialty versus non-specialty? So I don't know if you all remembered, like if you proposed the measure or not, but yeah, feel free to chime in.
Yeah, can you tell us about the out-of-pocket versus member paid options?
Well, my question was more like, what is the difference between the two? And I know the person who proposed member paid amount did mention like including premiums in the member paid amount. So I wonder if that's what they're thinking, or are there other things that make it member paid amount different from out-of-pocket cost?
I don't think you'd include premiums. That's really stretching.
I mean, premiums can't be attributed to a single drug, right?
Exactly.
So I think when you're doing a specific, like, I don't know how you would assign premiums to a specific drug. I mean, every drug has an impact on premiums, but there's no way to quickly suss that apart.
Yes, I'm not familiar with the member paid amount figure. Does anyone have a definition of that?
Is that a
Oh,
copay? I mean, it's just
yeah. So an out-of-pocket cost, could be um, in addition to other things related to what a person could pay. And I think that's kind of where that premium may be. A member paid amount is a field that we have in our drug database that just shows what the member paid, at that pharmacy, which could include like copay coupons and not necessarily reflect what the patient actually paid. So, for example, because, the claim on the insurance runs first, we see that member paid amount as maybe like $100, but then a copay coupon may come in on the back and reduce it to $5. So then the actual out-of-pocket cost is $5, but the member paid amount, is reflected to be 100.
Yeah, I don't think out of pocket cost has a specific. I mean, out of pocket cost, Ryan, to your point, I mean, like, doesn't have a specific definition. I think it's a broader term. It includes co-payments, co-insurance, and deductibles that patients pay usually at the point of sale. I mean, again, usually we're not talking about premiums and thinking about out of pocket costs for drugs, just colloquially, but obviously the term just means how much patients spent. I think Ryan, your point is member paid is just how payers are tracking how much the patient is responsible for, the member in their eyes, it's not patients, right? It's members are responsible for, but it doesn't tell you how much they actually paid at the point of sale. That number would be known by the pharmacy, but not by the payer. The payer just knows how much the patient is responsible for, and if the patient finds other means like a coupon card or something to pay off that, that wouldn't be reflected in APCD data.
And one thing I would maybe say, just as we're thinking about all of these measures kind of generally, right? So we're trying to use these as a filter to take a list of 400 some odd down to a much more manageable. So in terms of what we're looking at, like in super detail or the difficulty of obtaining the data, I think that's important to consider at this stage. So like if we're doing a specific drug review on a specific drug, that's where we can dig down more and kind of get maybe into more of the weeds or the nitty gritty of, okay, how does this work on this one? But in terms of, for example, collecting difficult to find data on a mass amount of drugs, I would suggest avoiding that at this point, because again, we're just trying to use this to filter down, right? We don't want to do an entire drug review on 400 drugs and the associated work of finding all of that detailed data on that, right? So as we're trying to define stuff and pick stuff, can we easily access this data? If we can't access it without a ton of extra work, like having to go out to all of the manufacturers to collect rebate data, I don't know if we want to do that at this point, right? And this is just me thinking out loud, right? So the board can, obviously feel free to chime in, or if we're trying to determine what are our insurance premiums for each of these drugs, and how can we try and suss that out to fit towards this, right? That could be hard.
Right. So I mean, just to be clear, you can, I mean, like, I think with the APC data availability, assuming that you can get individual member paid amounts, I think there's still something to determine with in terms of how you want that data presented or sort of aggregated at the drug level for you. So, I mean, for example, like it may not be sort of normally distributed. So do you want to look at the mean or average? Do you want to look at a median amount? Do you want to look at how many patients pay over a certain threshold, right? So there are different ways to assess the sort of aggregated data that the board could consider in terms of like how it's thinking about sort of, we want to look at drugs where, at least 20% of patients are paying more than X dollars, right? So those are decisions that you all could make. I think it's that, and instruct your data team to sort of provide you with that type of information. But, you probably don't want to have like 18 different ways of slicing the data, because it's going to be challenging for you at that point to like look through those different 18 data points and try to come up with a coherent story across many different drugs. So you do want to be, to that point, you want to be sort of somewhat judicious and just, you're trying to get an idea of which drugs you want to do further investigation of.
Yeah. What are your most important data points that will help us sort this stuff out?
Exactly. It's not perfect.
That's a great point, Ben.
Doug?
Yeah, I completely agree that I don't think premium should be involved or accounted for. But yeah, going back to this out-of-pocket cost measure, like I actually I think I heard some conflicting information on whether or not that would account for coupons. I thought Ryan said it did, but I didn't know that that was
All payer
observable
claims
anywhere.
will all payer claims won't.
Okay, and so I mean, obviously we would want to see that, but I don't think it's visible anywhere, right? Is it possible to observe coupon amount?
It's possible to observe it from data sets that collect information from the pharmacy level, because pharmacies obviously know who's paying them. So there are data sets out there, like commercial data sets that aggregate and collect that information. So I'll leave it to your team to decide whether you have access to those data sets, those commercial data sets, to do it. So it's not that it's impossible to find out that information, but you're right. It's not readily available in claims data, which is the predominant source and sort of the internal source that you have at your disposal.
So Kelly, we don't have any of those options that would tell us the coupons. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. Yeah, well, so then, from my perspective, the out-of-pocket cost that they report in the APCD is what we have, and I agree with Mike that at this stage, working with what we have is obviously is important and expeditious. So, yeah, certainly my for me the most important criteria that we've discussed so far would be the distribution of out-of-pocket costs, and so in addition to the mean, I would want to see like maybe the 5th percentile and 95th percentile, maybe 5th, 25th, 75th, 95th. I'm already at 5 data points, but that's kind of that distribution to me, I think is very important. The most important thing on this of any of the criteria we've talked about.
Doug, I don't understand what you're saying. Could you percentage it?
Yeah, so like the 5th percentile of out-of-pocket costs would mean that so there's a value, let's say it's $20. That would mean that 5% of people pay less, or 5% of claims are less than $20, and then 95% of claims are greater than $20.
On that particular drug, or compared to the other drugs?
On that drug. So it would be like if you had a data set of all of the claims for one drug, and then you sorted them by how much the out-of-pocket cost was. And then you basically just cut it up at these specific percentiles. And so that's helpful because the mean can be weighted by if there's a few really high cost observations that pulls the mean higher, or if the vast majority of observations are low and cheap. But so by getting those percentages as well, you get a better picture of if there are tails of the distribution that are meaningful in either their inexpensiveness or their expensiveness.
So, and you're talking about on the out of pocket, wouldn't that vary depending? There'd be a big variation then on the coverage, like how much a plan, like if somebody buys a cheap plan that has a high deductible, they're going to have a lot bigger out of pocket. That doesn't seem like it's an even playing field for the drugs.
And copay, then a copay versus a percentage of, so some plans you pay 20% of the cost, and then others you might have a $10 copay. So you've got that variation.
I completely agree. All those things will affect out-of-pocket costs, but if we want to get a picture of what out-of-pocket costs are among the users of these drugs in Washington State, I don't think that we should. I don't think we necessarily want to equalize, or I should say, adjust for the plan generosity. We want to see what are people spending. That to me, that's the measure of affordability that I care most about. And even if they have, let's say that you have whatever non-generous insurance or bad insurance, and you have to pay more, that doesn't mean that I care less about that high payment. To me, that's still potentially an affordability problem.
Sure. All right, but I guess I'm just thinking that the total cost of the prescription drug, what the carrier pays and what the patient pays, is probably more
I agree. Yeah, I think total cost is my second most important criteria, but I agree it's also important. And actually, I do think that Kelly wants us to talk about how we define that as well. So maybe we should get to that. But yeah, I think they're both important. And like to me, affordability to consumers is, or I should say to patients is like the where I see the most direct measure of cost burden on patients is from those out-of-pocket costs. And so that's why it's the most important to me. Yeah.
Ping Ping, you have a comment, question?
Sorry, I correct the wrong button.
So Kelly, is my request for out-of-pocket cost, distribution reasonable? Then I guess I should ask, the rest of the board if they have other thoughts on like how they might be interested in measuring out-of-pocket costs. Like Ben was saying, like, you could potentially say like, number of users who pay more than $50 or something like that.
Yeah, I'll just point out, Doug, that like, I mean, again, I'm basing this in part on experience looking at the public Colorado dashboard. So you need to so you need to decide how you're gonna and their sort of methodology document. You need to decide how you're gonna create a bucket of patients. So it might be that all patients with at least one claim for a drug, or one, paid claim within the year or something, like that might be your definition. But you have to remember that includes patients who started the drug midway through the year, patients who are not adherent because of high costs. It includes a lot of things, right? So it tends to underestimate like actual total spend and out-of-pocket spend, right? Because you're going to have a mix of patients who have one claim and patients who took the drug the whole year. Some drugs are not taken chronically, right? So like if it's a hepatitis C antiviral, like most people will have claims they might have like 3 months worth of claims and then that's it. And so anyway, but just to point out that like how you define that population. But in general, yeah, I mean, it's like easy to get the number of people who took the drug in that year. It's easy to sort of sum up a bunch of measures around sort of both member and total pay. And then again, you just have to sort of decide as a board how you want those presented to you, how you want those data points presented to you.
So I totally agree. Defining the sample is critical. My gut first stab would be among patients with at least one claim in the year. I'd want to see what the sort of mean cost per month was. I guess, whatever, you could do it per year too, but I certainly would want to restrict to those with at least one claim.
Well, I think tiering will make a big difference too on where it's placed in the formulary, right? And so with generic, you could gonna have lower out-of-pocket costs. And if it's a tier 2, tier 3 brand, non-preferred, I don't know if there's a way if that information shows up, but you can make a guesstimate based on that. So for the question of specialty versus non-specialty, well, for specialty, you're probably paying 20% of drug cost or the highest copay level. So
Yeah, and that's what we want to capture, right? As with whatever measures we're using for out-of-pocket costs. It can be because it had a high co-insurance rate because it was in a higher tier. It can be maybe it's used by people who tend to have high deductible plans, and so then they're spending a lot more out of pocket for it. In either case, it's something that can push it into unaffordability, and so that's what I want to capture.
Any other comments or questions on this slide?
Kelly,
Yeah, well, I guess there's the bullet point 1 and 3. So Kelly, did you want to talk about how to define total cost for the drug?
Yeah, I just like clarification on like what costs would go into that calculation.
So for me, that would be like patient paid amount or out-of-pocket plus plan paid amount minus rebate, and ideally minus rebate minus coupon. I know we can't observe that, so I'm willing to. That doesn't have to be in there at this stage. Do we have rebate information in any of our data sources?
no, it won't be.
No.
So we would be talking about a net cost, Doug. If that's what you're looking for, then.
Yeah.
Right. So if you wanted rebate information from each plan separately, Doug, you'd have to, you'd have to ask the plans that information if they're not already reporting it to your state in some way. Some states have reporting requirements, but that's generally aggregated and rolled up, but it's not at the claim level, right? So if your analyst is doing work to sort of look at the APCD data and provide you information, that's going to be pre-rebate, pre-coupons, manufacturer
Yeah,
assistance
I
program, et cetera.
didn't know if it was possible to sort of to sort of figure out how much rebate to disaggregate the rebate into users
So
or
there are
claims.
So there are data sets that give an estimated rebate for a set of drugs like SSR Health and some of these other, anyway, there's data sets that provide those sort of estimates. So the way Colorado dealt with this is that they just had that as part of their data that they reviewed as well. And again, but it wasn't like they didn't sort of combine those two data points together. They kept them separate for the purposes of selection.
So that's a really good point. Maybe another one of the additional criteria that we consider is rebates. Actually, I think that was on the list, wasn't it, Kelly?
Yeah, but we don't have access to that data at this point because the bill says that they have to cooperate with us to provide data, but at the affordability review stage, I mean, we could ask, but they by law don't have to cooperate if they don't want to.
What about SSR Health?
Yeah, so those are not actual rebates. Those are just estimated rebates by a third party. So they get you in the right ballpark generally of whether it's a sort of highly rebated or a non-highly rebated drug. If you want specifically how much on a particular drug in your state by a particular plan, you would need to ask the plan or the manufacturer,
and that seems, well, I mean,
the rebate level, Doug, it's extremely difficult on a drug level to get. A lot of time they correlate with other in the same specific category or within the manufacturing. It's all combined. Even as a plan sponsor myself, I'm trying to get a drug level rebate amount and I'm not able to. That's how difficult it is.
Yeah. So I guess I think that sort of motivates Colorado's approach that Ben just told us about, where you don't use the rebate information to calculate a net cost. You have that's an additional criterion that you are evaluating when you're deciding to do an affordability review or actually what stage did they incorporate it now when deciding to do the affordability review, or did they decide do it at the next level when deciding on the upper payment limits? Ben, do you know in Colorado which stage?
Sorry, say that. Repeat your question one more time.
So you said they had the rebate information from SSR Health and they incorporated that as an additional criterion.
Right. So they couldn't share that information publicly. So if you look at the public dashboard, that's
okay.
Right, because they have a data use agreement.
So what stage of their
it was
process?
Part of the dashboard that the board members could review when determining drugs, but it was not one of the key factors that they decided on when sort of moving drugs into when deciding whether to select drugs. Right, they focused on that information more in the affordability review.
Selecting drugs for affordability review or for UPLs?
The data was there. It was presented to the board members.
Okay.
And I don't remember off the top of my head for Maryland, but we can look into that information. Again, I would just note that SSR Health is imperfect and these sort of estimates. And so I would not, and it's not going to be available for all drugs, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's just, that's why you want to make sure that whatever data points you're sort of heavily relying on in terms of winnowing down your list of drugs to ones that you ultimately want to select, you want to make sure that they're stable estimates that can be, calculated for all of the drugs, and rebate estimates are not going to be in that category. So just putting it out. So it might be a factor. I believe that Colorado flagged it as a contextual factor that the board members could consider when making those decisions.
I mean, I like that approach. I don't know if Mike can tell us if it's feasible for us to acquire new data sets like SSR Health.
Yeah, we could look into that. I mean, right now, Kelly was saying we don't have access to it. So it's something we could try and look into so we can create estimates based on that. But I would kind of, for right now, the data that we have, what we can run with, I think that the total cost would just be like the patient and plan paid amounts. And that's kind of where we could run right
Yeah.
now.
And I definitely agree with that as the calculation to use for total cost. But yeah, I mean, I think that you know, this having rebates as a separate, you know, the existence of rebates as a separate measure, separately measured when it's an observable, you know, a contextual factor, would certainly be helpful for, you know, as making the decisions at the next stage.
I think they're less hesitant to provide it if nothing is extremely specific. So we may, I think, perhaps try asking for PMPM of the specific drug line. Because then the total cost, but how it's like how many lives are on it, are using it, right? So PMPM of the specific drug in a plan, they might be able to have that. Or I don't know if they're willing to share. They have it. I don't know if they're willing to share it.
Yeah, and as we're doing like specific drug reviews on a much smaller select group of drugs, that's where we could go out and ask for manufacturer information more easily, you know, because it's a lot easier to ask for, you know, a handful versus 400, right? And so that's where we could probably dig in more is on the specific drug review, and that would help obviously influence like, oh, is this affordable? Is it not? You know, there's other factors on the.
That's a good point. Yeah.
So yeah, we don't have to get everything in this go around again. We're just trying to what we have. How do we whittle this down to a smaller, more manageable list to choose from? Yeah, we can look into the other data, and we can definitely on the review itself focus on.
And Doug, to your point, like I think there's two questions. One is what data points you want, and then two is how you're going to think about those data points in the form of selection. And so, and again, for when you have the more data points you have, the more conflicting directions you'll have between different drugs. So, so I think, you know, helping sort of to prioritize among a small number of data points just to sort of get you into the universe of drugs that you're going to dive deep on does not mean that you're going to review those drugs and deem them unaffordable. It doesn't mean you're going to move forward and set an upper payment limit on those drugs, right? You're just trying to get a small universe of drugs to do a deep dive so your staff has the resources to provide you a much deeper level of conversation. And so I'm just, you know, echoing what Mike just said, that like at the point of the dashboard, there's going to be imperfections in the data that you all are going to have to recognize and sort of yet move forward to make decisions based on what you have and what's readily available for all of the drugs, and what you think is, you know, at least getting you in the ballpark of drugs that that when you ultimately review that you may be worried about affordability challenge or affordability for consumers.
Kelly, anything else that you need from this slide? Comments, or should we move on to discussion points?
Didn't really talk about specialty.
We didn't really talk about, specialty versus non-specialty.
Yeah, so I'm wondering how the board wants to classify specialty versus non-specialty drugs.
I think it's a lot of time it's defined by the payers. You know, there are cases where, you know, the PCSK9s, when it first came out, or the headache medication, the injections started out as specialty, and then it basically became non-specialty. I mean, there's a specific, I have a definition for it, but it's a lot of time, like the 80-20, we know the 80% of it, and then there's 20 of them, it's like the specialty light, you know, can be one or the other depending on the payer.
Can I ask? I'm curious. Whoever like decided, you know, wanted to include that as a criteria. What's the motivation for why does specialty matter when we're considering affordability?
Any thoughts on that one? Does it matter?
my thought for why it would matter is basically a specialty drug would be less likely to have a therapeutic equivalent or alternative, but that's already captured in our other criteria that we have to consider, on the ones we must consider. So this one, it just seems, unless there's another element of specialty that I'm missing, it seems redundant with the equivalent and alternative availability.
I don't know, perhaps the tiering, the formulary, or
Right. So yeah, I guess specialty is more likely to be in a more expensive tier. So
Yeah.
but then that would get captured in the out-of-pocket costs. Yeah.
What will you pick up by defining that we don't already have?
Yeah, I don't know. That's my question too.
Yeah, and if there's no, nothing that anyone's passionate about, I want this for this reason, or if we're looking at it and other things, we can't look at every single thing, so, it's good.
I think maybe it's just the need to have like a better definition or something for information. But we can use a generic description.
Okay, well, that flows oops, sorry. That flows nicely into the next slide that I have about discussion points. So like for some of the categories like drug costs, there are a lot of very similar very similar measures. So for example, in this slide, there are a bunch of similar measures like I feel like I don't know if the board wants to just choose a few measures, or they want to, like I mentioned, just look at all the measures that there are available. And then on the same note, we can also talk about methodology. Like, do you want to rank and weigh the data measures and use some sort of formula to choose the drugs for review, or some sort of hybrid measure where you agree on a few that are important to you, but then you also want to look at other data measures, I guess on your own? Or I guess this is kind of going to be the hardest part, like choosing like how you want to use the data available. So yeah, Portal, feel free to chime in here with more information on what other states have done.
Yeah, I think Ben had to run, unfortunately.
But we still have Matt here, I believe.
Oh, okay, great.
Yeah, I'm happy to sort of chime in terms of what other states have done. So Colorado's approach in general, they went through a sort of weighting exercise where each board member prioritized of the sort of set list of criteria, the selection criteria that they had to review under statute, prioritized that, and then went through a process to weight those elements based on the prioritization of each individual board member to try to get to a prioritized list of drugs. So that was sort of one approach, and then they used that dashboard. The Maryland board did more of they had like more of an internal process, and board members were able to nominate drugs or put drugs forth for discussion based on the criteria that they were presented with, and then would have votes on adding or removing drugs from the selected list over the course of their meeting. So more of a sort of guided weighting exercise versus more of a deliberation discussion-based approach. There's opportunity to sort of be in the middle of those two approaches. Those are by no means the only two, but that's just sort of the path that others have gone down thus far.
I really like the Colorado approach of the board members sort of ranking and weighting the measures they care about.
And there may be an opportunity to go through that sort of weighting exercise to narrow the list down from like 500 down to 100. And then from there, you can be sort of more deliberative and get more detail on the specific subset of drugs. I believe that that is what Colorado did as well, is they presented some data points for all the 500, 400 plus drugs that qualified under their statute. And then before they made the final selections decisions, asked their staff to provide additional details on a smaller cohort of drugs. Before they then selected the final 5 that they did for this round.
I mean, I think we've already been talking about this, these discussion points for past half an hour.
But yeah, I mean, I do think that like in order to formalize a ranking of all the drugs, it sounded to me like I was more in favor of out-of-pocket costs, and then others maybe were more in favor of total costs. And so it's okay, we can disagree on that. I think that's but like formally attaching a weight to the different measures will allow us to then get it, get a list of drugs ranked by how much we want to do a review. And so is there an option for us to do, Kelly, do you think that you'd be able to conduct some type of ranked choice voting with weights among us to figure out what those weights are for each of the different criteria?
I think there's sort of like 2 questions here. So first is, do you want to use all the measures? And then the second would be the ranking and weighting of the data measures you want to use.
I agree. So do we have a proposed full list of measures, and then we can add and strike as we
You kind of had some lists previously. Do we want to go through those? Because I know we've talked about total cost. I know we've talked about out-of-pocket costs. I don't know, do we want to pick the top 4 or 5 to try, so we don't want to be pulling data on 20 different things, right? It starts to get impossible to manage and sort.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I also want to mention that these measures were collected from the board members, and all of them seem to be the most important to them. So it might not be as easy as we imagine to strike off and come to.
Well, maybe then each board member gets 25% of the ranking power, and then they're all just wait. Whatever my measures are worth 25%, Hung's are worth 25%, etc. But I did have one idea for getting rid of some measures, and maybe we can talk about just thinking about cost and utilization. We have like out-of-pocket costs. Let's just say we're looking at mean out-of-pocket costs per user. I think that's important. But then, because we also care about how many people use it, how many people are paying that mean out-of-pocket cost, we would want to see if we multiply mean out-of-pocket costs by number of users, we would have the total out-of-pocket costs for all users in the state, which I think would be a nice way of incorporating sort of the prevalence or how common the use of that drug is. And that way, I don't think we would need any other of the utilization measures. Correct me if I'm wrong, if anyone else has other instincts on that. But to me, yeah, it's just if we're capturing the total out-of-pocket costs among all users and then also per user, I think that gives us a nice picture of the total burden to the state as well as the burden to individual users.
Well, let me just, I'll lay something out and tell me if it is trying to follow this. I'm not doing that well. If, let's say, oh God, hemophilia, where there's not as, it's very expensive drugs, but not as many people. So I'm not sure how expensive it is these days, but anyhow, would that fit the utilization by disease state? If they all have to use the drugs but it's a small population, would that make the cut? I guess that's what I'm trying to figure out by the way you phrased it.
So yeah, that would, if it's a very expensive drug for a small population, the out-of-pocket costs, the mean out-of-pocket cost per user would be high. And so if we decided that was a measure we care about, then yes, it would make the cut. And so I think what Matt was talking about in Colorado, where they put weights on where they rank the measures they care about and put weights on them. That would allow us to say like, okay, that's a measure we really care about because it would capture something like hemophilia where it's expensive for a small number of people. And then alternatively, like, let's say that there's a drug that's like moderately expensive, but it's used by like 1 million people.
Right.
Then that would be captured by this other measure, which would be like the total out-of-pocket costs in the state.
Yeah, and for those like hemophilia, I mean it's probably gonna be orphan or rare disease cases, so which would be not be included. Likely, right? So
Yeah, it wouldn't have made our original cut if it's not an eligible drug because it's orphan, right? Is that what you're
So I
saying?
picked the wrong disease.
No, but your point your point makes total sense. Yeah.
Okay, so we got total costs, we got out-of-pocket costs, and then we have the out-of-pocket costs times usage is our third thing that we're thinking about looking at.
yeah, I want number of people using the drug, or percent, which is related to percentage population, I think. Because we want to affect the masses. It's
Okay, so number of people using the drug. Do we want like the therapeutic equivalent availability?
Yes. So how do we define that? Does that just if there's another so if it's an equivalent, that means that there's a generic or a biosimilar, right?
That's about
So-
therapeutics.
Yeah.
And then an alternative would be if there's options within the same class. Is that right? But not the same ingredient?
Yeah, I think the alternative would just be anything else that, could be used to treat that condition.
Kelly, is that feasible for you to sort of operationalize in the data?
So for alternative, my understanding is that it can also include drugs in a different class because sometimes like a drug of a different indication could also treat that. I don't know if Ryan or Donna is on that. They can comment on that. So that's why it's not as straightforward to pull as just pulling other drugs in the same class.
Right. Yeah. And that's something that we've been exploring. I know that Portal sent a methodology proposal of looking at therapeutic guidelines. And so that may be another option, to look at. We don't necessarily have that in a readily available electronic format, and we would need to do, searching to find what are appropriate guidelines. But that could be one way of doing that therapeutic alternative selection.
But for the purposes of this exercise of trying to just whittle down the list, might it be easier to just stick with equivalent for now? To saying, okay, there are other options that we know about, that we can easily, compare. And then if we want to, for example, like a drug review where we've got to do more manual stuff or more data digging, we could look at the alternatives, right, for a specific drug review. But for this, just trying to get this list down, the equivalent be an easier, better thing to stay with.
I mean, I think it's important that we think about this as the first cut.
Yeah,
And we can get more sophisticated once we get that first list of, 50, 100, whatever
Yeah.
it is. But it seems like that's where our focus needs to be.
Yeah, and I will say that other states, the therapeutic alternative process that happened during the review itself, because there is a bit of, clinical decision making that goes on in terms of what you include, whether it's first line, second line, et cetera. And because there may be variation within indications, whereas for the therapeutic equivalents, are there generics or biosimilars is a more of a binary that could be pulled for a larger set of drugs up front.
I agree. That sounds reasonable. And then, but on the equivalent, what's the difference between generic availability and therapeutic equivalent availability? Therapeutic equivalent would just include biosimilars as well as generic equivalents. Is that right?
Generally, yes. I think the therapeutic equivalent term is sort of the terminology that's used like in the Orange Book, which is where it lists all of the drugs and their equivalents.
Or CWs afterwards.
Yeah.
Okay, so it seems like we could remove generic availability from this list because it's already included in the therapeutic equivalent availability.
Well, are we saying so equivalent would be like a substitute available, whereas a alternative availability is a provider will have to write the prescription, right? It's a drug that it may not be the same active ingredient, but it does
Yeah, I agree on the alternative. And I think what Mike had suggested was that we ignore alternative availability for now, just because that's quite complicated for the filter at this stage.
Yeah, but the generic and the therapeutic equivalent, I think we can kind of combine that.
Yes, that's what I was suggesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think the generics are considered therapeutic equivalents based on our definition, because you're using the Orange Book, and then also we're classifying biosimilars as therapeutic equivalents based on the bill, but other than that, it's completely based on the Orange Book.
So Orange Book has a separate distinction for generic availability. So basically therapeutic equivalent availability does not include generics in the Orange Book.
I think therapeutic equivalent is different from generic. Can a pharmacist chime in?
Different definition. I know when we passed the bills that generic is classified as one thing and therapeutic equivalent. We had to be very careful how we phrased all of that. So,
right. Well, I guess we got to learn what these words mean before we make a decision on it. Hug, do you know? You're a pharmacist friend here.
Ryan, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, I'm thinking about it. I'm trying to figure out, is therapeutic equivalent all types of ratings in the orange and purple books, whereas generic availability is AB rated, right? I mean, is that kind of how it may have been intended, or is it? Yeah, so I need to think about it a bit longer to think about what is the difference between the equivalent and a generic. I'm thinking there might be some aspect of interchangeability and the different ratings, within the orange and purple book, but I don't know right now.
But I mean, even with that, it's adding one more component with the generic availability. So it seems to me that it's probably not a huge issue to include both.
Yeah, I would agree.
I agree.
Okay. We can make sure what we're doing. I guess the point is that the equivalents are both in there.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so we got total costs, out of pocket costs, number of people using the drug, therapeutic and generic, therapeutic equivalent and generic availability. And then we were talking about the out-of-pocket time for usage. So that's 5. Anything else?
Well, I think we'd still want to know if it's multiple thresholds.
Okay.
What do you mean by that?
That like if there's more that it meets that it's how much it costs, 50% increase, that They already did that, I mean, basically.
Yeah.
That, oh, the first, that
That
first
cut,
four
yeah.
hundred, starting
Yeah.
with that first 400, yeah.
Did it qualify under multiple?
Yeah.
Right.
thresholds? Yeah.
Right, narrow it down.
Anything else on those lists that Kelly had?
So you're gonna get back to us on the question about how, and how other, I guess, how other states are doing it with like the nitroglycerin when there was what, 5 or 6 all on the multiple list, but it's just different strengths of the same thing. So is that one drug review or is that 6 drug reviews? That's one of a question I have.
Great question.
Probably be one drug rather than 6 drug reviews. I think in terms of some of these aspects, that would be the same in terms of looking at utilization and costs. We could probably pool that together and show you, here's the differences between the NDCs, but have that kind of be together as one drug review.
I would hope it would only be one drug review. I just want to make sure when we're,
And I will say, in terms of Colorado and Maryland, their general approaches have been, I think, that if one NDC like qualified, or if the board selected one NDC, then all other NDCs would get rolled up into that affordability review. Now that obviously depends on sort of statute and rule that may differ between your board and theirs, but the data was displayed to them or given to their board disaggregated, which there are both pros and cons to that, in that if the utilization and some of these measures are more evenly distributed across different NDCs, NDCs may show up lower down the list in terms of ranking. But if you aggregated them all together at once, that drug may move higher up the list. But their rule was established that regardless of if they picked the NDC, then all of the other NDCs that correspond to that, the active ingredient, would fall into their review.
So to me, I think it comes down to we have to define this level, right? And the way that we defined level when we made the eligibility list was at the NDC level. We can change that for the review level. We can have a different level for review. But what I want to know is, do we know what our level is for the UPL? Because I feel like we should be doing it the same level for the affordability review. Does that make sense? And does anyone know what the level is for UPL?
ask that again. I didn't,
Yeah.
I guess I didn't follow you.
So I'm since ultimately the upper payment limit will be our the policy leverage that we have. What level does the UPL apply at? Does the UPL apply to an NDC? Like if we use the nitroglycerin example, does it apply to one of those NDCs or does it apply to all 6? And that's so. I don't know, Matt. Do you know what Colorado did?
I think since they've just now sort of got to the UPL phase in rulemaking, I'm not quite sure sort of where they've landed on that question, but I think generally that the thinking is that, the bucket of NDCs that were in the review, they may at least consider during the UPL process. But I don't think they've been specific yet on sort of at the granular level where the UPL would apply.
Does anyone know if our law specifies anything about this? Or do we have flexibility? I don't know.
That's one of the AG's office needs to look at that question, I think. We might be able to clarify in WAC. I don't know whether, and I don't know what I remember anything on the statute on that.
I don't. Yeah, I think we need to have a little bit further discussion with the AG on that.
Okay, so that sounds like a I agree. This is critical um, and will be super important for how we do as you know this selecting drugs for the affordability review means that we have to have like they have to be put into the buckets that they would be in their review, and so I think for that we need to know um, what the level is would be for the UPL.
What, any further discussion?
Well, just to ask, are we so Mike just made a list of the measures we care about. Is that going to be like sent out to us to give weights and things?
So yeah, we can send out the list. So right now what I got, total cost, the out-of-pocket cost times usage calculation, number of people using the drug, therapeutic equivalents and generics, and did it meet the multiple thresholds? So that's 6 different things. So then, yeah, I think we need to send that out to take a look at. We can have our data team starting to figure out how to pull that. Now, then, yeah, it comes to the point of weighting here. So, and Kelly, did we have anything else further in this presentation here? That you needed to get through here before I completely derail stuff?
No, I just wanted to remind everyone that the board would have to consider like when they want to incorporate advisory group input into the process, because that's a required thing from the bill.
Yeah, I don't know why we wouldn't do that at every stage. Is there any? I mean, I guess it would slow us down a little bit, but because you were kind of presenting options of like doing it, now, later, or both. That was basically the options, right?
So in terms of the advisory group, right? So right now we're selecting the metrics that the board wants, correct? To take a look at this. The advisory group has not been appointed yet, so they're not even here to select these metrics. So if we waited for them to do this, that's more time. Whereas I think maybe something that would be a good way to do. So the board selects the metrics, we can weight it, we can create the dashboard, and then from there we can share that dashboard with the advisory group here in the fall. They can then look through all this data, look through the drug list, and discuss, what do they think is important? Is there specific drugs from an advocacy standpoint, XYZ, that they want to look at? And then so from there, while the board's looking at the dashboard, the advisory group can also look at the dashboard, come through to try and use those recommendations to create the short list, and then the board can select the drugs.
I mean, that makes sense, and I think that's really the purpose of the advisory board, not to get at the very front end, but once we have that front end done.
Yeah, I see them more as, advising with their different perspectives on the data that we're putting together. But I don't know that they necessarily need to be building this data.
I think you'd have a lot of
for us,
probably take a very long time to accomplish what we're trying to.
Too many cooks in the kitchen at that point.
Yeah.
There would not have been a separate advisory board that does the same thing as the board. That's not.
Yeah, that's not the purpose.
Not the purpose.
So does that kind of make sense? And any comments, questions? Kelly, does that answer what you need to know?
Yeah, sounds good.
Wonderful.
Shouldn't sound convincing.
Okay, any other burning questions you need answered, Kelly?
Nope.
Okay.
You were right.
And then, so that kind of takes us to the end of your presentation, right? Kelly?
Oh yeah, I think we just skipped the next step slide because I think we kind of covered it during the discussion.
So then I guess the next part then is, Kelly, you can use these data measures to create a dashboard. And then in terms of weighting, what do you need to sort out or prioritize this?
Well, I think the board would need to come back to us with their rankings.
Like what they think is the most important out of these?
Yeah, so I guess everybody would like theoretically they would rank the measures from in order, and then we would have to somehow reconcile the rankings.
I have a suggestion. If we ranking, a flaw in ranking is that, let's say there's 6 measures. Let's say that I only actually care at all about 5 of them. I don't want that 6th one given any weight at all. So rather than, just if I just rank them 1 to 6, it implicitly assumes that I still care about the 6th one, right? But if we give them like a weight, and so let's say that there's the 6 options, and I decide I want to give 80% weight to the first one, 5% to the second one, and then I say 15% to the second one, 5% to the third one, and then 0 to the other 3. That way it gives the board members the opportunity to omit the measures that they don't care about.
So if each board member gets 25 points, they assign those 25 points to the 6 measures. We add those up, and then we will get our 100% from that.
Love that.
Yeah. And get a ranking. Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. Cool. So we can send these out and then ask for your division of your 25 points, and then we can add that up and then use that to help create the dashboard.
That'll work.
Love solving problems. Great.
Yeah.
That seemed too easy.
Yeah. It's all right.
Okay. So any other questions or comments on? It sounds like we've got our data we want to look at. We know where we're going to pull it from. We've got our ranking that we can send out here after this meeting. Anything else on this from the board members?
Just a quick question on the I think there's some details on some of those measures that I'm sure Kelly will make good decisions on, but I'm just curious if we'll be able to see, the whatever, if the out-of-pocket cost, is it like among users, it's the average cost per month of a claim, or of all of their claims. Like I trust her to make a good decision on that. I just want to make sure that we can see those details somewhere.
Yeah, and I think as we're writing this up, because this again could be another policy, right, in terms of how we're our selection methodology, we can write up where we're getting the data from, how we're calculating that, et cetera, right? So we can share that with the board during the next meeting.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Right, are we ready for the next agenda item?
Meeting time.
Meeting times?
I think so.
All right. I'll turn it over to Simon.
This is pretty quick. And it kind of falls in the category like the annual report where you have to book out the room very far in advance. And so we're just setting the meeting times. We're thinking of sticking with the same schedule where we meet approximately every 3rd Wednesday on the odd months. So that would be January 15th, March 19th, May 21st, July 16th, September 17th, and November 19th. And
It's third Wednesday of the odd months.
yeah.
Good to have it.
what I can do is send this out an email to the board members and I just check it against your calendars.
That'd be great.
And I think it was this year, the schedules were tough, so we obviously had dug online for most of it. But if there's a way to make it work where people would prefer to be in person or if everybody wants to be online, we can work that out over email too.
It's nice to see faces.
Yeah.
I mean, as long as it's Wednesdays, I'm gonna be remote because it's like it's my busiest day and I have it's like all this afternoon stuff. But I don't mind being remote. But if we want it, because I feel like we chose Wednesdays because it worked better for everybody else, and so I'm fine. I'm fine with that.
It could be a Tuesday or Thursday. I mean, if we wanted to change it,
Thursdays are bad for me because
Thursdays are usually bad for me too,
but Tuesdays are okay.
Good days.
Just to upset you, Simon.
Yeah. Just would, Simon. So. If you want to look at Tuesdays as a possibility, but I do understand the room issue and yeah.
We're pretty flexible. I can also circle back with our team.
You just have to get ahead of everybody else.
Yeah, exactly.
I know how this works.
Yeah, sounds good. I'll shoot an email out with these and then we can figure out the right day.
Okay. Great. Any other questions, comments on that? Doug?
Not on the timing, just another question unrelated, so I can wait.
I think that's kind of it.
Go ahead.
For the meetings.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about the UPL coverage guide spreadsheet. I think Simon, did you make this?
Yes, based on advice from the AG.
Yeah, it's great. I love it. I just don't. Can you explain to me that there's like the three tabs. We've got plan type overview, OIC covered lives breakdown, and then UMP covered lives breakdown. So the OIC, that's the Office of the Insurance Commissioner. And then there's the UMP, that's the Universal Medical Plan. So the UMP plans are not under the OIC, is that right?
So
They're regulated through Healthcare Authority. We do follow some of the OIC regulations, so things like the appeal rights and the patient bill of rights, but otherwise the jurisdiction for UMP is under the umbrella of Healthcare Authority.
Okay. And then is that just so that the UMP tab is empty? Is that just a work in progress?
That gets updated and there's PDFs online, and so I just shared those separately because instead of copying all the info, I figured.
Oh, I got it. Okay. I did see those. Okay. Makes more sense now.
But the UMP is covered under the almost all of the same things. So like the UPL, the UMP is covered under.
Yeah. That's what the spreadsheet says. That makes sense. I was just confused about why, sort of just the breakdown of the different tabs and what went where, but now I get it.
Any other questions?
So
Not for me.
do we have anyone signed up for public comment?
Yes, we got one email in advance of Daria McGrew asking to speak, and then I'll look, see if there's any participant hands up as well.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay, so we've got also one other hand up, Brian Warren, and then anyone in the room want to speak? No. I don't know if Daria, since you had signed up in advance, if you want to go first, I'll allow to talk.
Thank you. Confirming you can hear me?
Yep,
Yes.
go ahead.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Daria McGrew, Director of State Policy on behalf of the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America, or PhRMA. Thank you very much for the thoughtful and nuanced discussion today. It's really heartening to hear all the board members and staff engaged so deeply in this. We appreciate the board going back to revisit how you are defining drug. It's really important that it be consistent across your analysis and not defined differently for different drugs. And it is important to get the data right at this early stage as we're seeing this roll out in other states. I want to highlight beyond the legal discussion today, a couple of reasons why that 7-year on the market metric is really important. The current proposal runs the risk of lumping together entirely different drugs that happen to have a common ingredient. There are many combined therapies on the market these days that offer big advances in treatment that could be treated as if they're the exact same drug when they're not. Also, at the time that the underlying statute was passed by the legislature, there was discussion about risks of unintended consequences of a UPL. We have significant concerns that it could limit access to the newest and best drugs when they come on the market. So not considering drugs until they have been on the market for at least 7 years was intended to mitigate potential harms of a UPL. And I caution the board against policy that whittles away or goes against the intent as it pertains to new and innovative drugs on the market. We have filed several letters, appreciate the board's consideration. We continue to highlight just a couple of other concerns submitted in those letters. One is intentional overcalculation by choosing high dose times high duration. I know the board has described the policy rationale there in the policy, but what you're saying is that you're intentionally choosing outliers and not an average patient. So it is, of course, hard to boil down people to averages, but we do have concerns with the intentional inclusion of outliers. And additionally, finally, here in Washington and in other states, manufacturers continue to ask for some kind of confidential mechanism where they can submit additional information as needed. There was a lot of discussion today about potentially in the future requesting data from manufacturers. So there may be cases in which a manufacturer would like to submit competitive or proprietary information for the board to consider when it isn't publicly available. And they'd like to have a kind of portal where they can submit or ask questions or submit proprietary information should that be necessary in the future. And again, refer you to our letters over the past couple of months for additional detail on any of these. Thank you so much.
You.
Thank you. Move next on this participant list is Brian Warren.
Hi, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yep. Yeah.
Thank you. Brian Warren with the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, or BIO. We represent biotech and life sciences companies in Washington as well as the rest of the country. My comments are specific to the drug eligibility list methodology policy. And it's something that I know that you guys discussed today and are going to be making or potentially making some changes based on board member feedback today. There was one other thing that we wanted to bring to your attention as a potentially unintended consequence of the way the policy was written, that authorizing statute, the RCW, exempts drugs from affordability review if they are approved only to treat rare diseases. And the way that the policy is written, it specifically essentially defines those drugs as treating rare diseases if they're approved under the FDA's orphan drug approval pathway. However, not every drug that is treating a rare disease was approved under the Orphan Drug Act approval pathway. So it's not a large number of products. However, this is something that, again, during the authorizing statutes consideration by the legislature, the rare disease drug exemption was intended to avoid access problems for a population of patients that oftentimes don't have a lot of other options. They have serious medical needs, and which is why this was created. So you may want to consider a pathway or option for the board to pull something off of the list of eligible products, even though it was not approved by through the Orphan Drug Act, as long as it is approved only for treating a rare disease, which is something that is defined in federal, and it could be defined also in this rule. Usually is the standard is a disease affecting fewer than 200,000 patients in the country. That is all that I have. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
Thank you. And next, S.
Seth Reiner.
Good morning. Thank you. For the discussion and presentation regarding the current eligibility list and ongoing review criteria, my name is Seth Greiner, and I'm an advocacy manager for the National Multiple Sclerosis Society. The MS Society supports affordability boards nationwide, and we will be submitting continued written comments concerning patient costs, assistance, data utilization, and stakeholder engagement. We again thank the board for their time and continued support for Washington consumers.
There was a Q&A box, and 2 people asked if the recording will be available after the meeting, and it will be. It'll be posted on the PDAP website. If there's no other ends or no other comments, we can close the public comment period.
Right. Looks like we've accomplished what we hoped to today. I appreciate everyone's engagement, and meeting can be adjourned.
All right. Thank you. Got done early.
Thanks.